Well, good morning again. I promised a short little one that would be somewhat political. It is not meant to be, but everything is about what you read into. Am I right? So I mentioned military background. The family, especially, grew up on a military base, more specifically a NORAD base. So yesterday there was a little news bite the wife read, and she asked about NATO, and so I explained, right, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and explained how it was the West's attempt to counter the Soviet bloc of countries in Europe. But what I did is I looked up NATO to show her, because again, it's been a long time since I was on that base. Never mind, right? Hearing about this stuff on a regular basis. Just, I think, because it's been in the news recently. So I looked it up on the interwebs, right? Having now using the computers for something more than just pressing a button, hitting play or record, and speaking into the computer. So searching up the text, hypertext information on the internet about NATO. So I don't use Wikipedia anymore because it seems to be, speaking of which, it seems to be political, I hear. But for me, I think I've mentioned it in a couple podcasts. Yogacara was a great example. If you look up Yogacara, it's not that everything was wrong, but a huge chunk of it was just wrong. But then if you go and look at the sources to see why, it all comes from one source that was just a chapter submitted to some, book. And if you're familiar with this, any of these subjects, really, they're subject to a lot of flim-flam artists, right? Publishing junk. Right? We've talked about some of this before. But so I went to Britannica. Seems to be one of the better alternatives on the internet. But like I've mentioned, Marcia McLuhan would be sad to hear that the internet, that which had so much potential, has now fallen prey to what I call, the anti-prosperity principle, or it's flying in the face of what I call the prosperity principle, the beauty of the written language, right? The Gutenberg project, if we want to call that, allowed a being, a consciousness, which is an ephemeral thing, but it allowed it to transcend time and space, geography and time, even language and culture, which arguably could be a barrier. But fast forward to today, there seems to be just an erasure of a lot of our knowledge. There's paywalls for so much research. I've mentioned this in a podcast that they took down a number of file sharing sites that were being used by students to be able to read all these different research papers, like literally Yogacara on Wikipedia as an example. I couldn't even access. It was hard. I had to use a torrent, I think, to finally access. I'm not sure, though. I think I was lucky enough to have access because of some scholar access to articles still. Excuse me, but that's not available to everybody. But finally accessing that referenced article was very difficult. But as I said, for me, it's not a good source of information, that Wikipedia, because of that reason. it's not uncommon there'll be factual errors, there'll be bias, or just plain and simple horrible sources. But if the sources aren't available, I myself have come across like dead links constantly, and that's really quite sad, right? So it seems that information is temporary. It's transitory. It's become ephemeral. So what used to be something that could transcend time and space is now even shorter lived than our lives ourselves. So what is that doing to us and our psyche, our consciousness, our language, our culture? I mean, I've pointed to Hervé Fischer's book. It's from 20 years ago. He said, what did he call it? Cyber primitif in French, these cyber primitives. It's called shock numérique, digital shock. And he talks about these paradoxical laws of the digital age. And the first one is our psyche regresses as technology advances. And he was prophetic. And I think it does go back to McLuhan. But the example I want to give, and it actually coincides with a theme of why I researched the classics growing up as best I could with the limits I had. Which, again, I mentioned this before, having access to audiobooks at an early age was a boon. But I was limited, right? I could only access, but some of the old stuff, Sun Tzu's Art of War, Miyamoto Musashi, I couldn't go down the whole list, but Clausewitz, Rommel. One of my favorite was The Unfettered Mind by Takuan Soho. Again, audiobooks is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And then Ivan Wentz, a lot of his books, but an educated warrior, a scholarly commander of military, of the martial arts. And I felt that was important, especially since I said I wanted to join to save lives and to keep the peace. I just mentioned this, I think, in the last couple days. That's what I wanted to do. Canada, at the time, 20, 30 years ago, don't quote me. I even was looking at joining the reserves because they said they needed adults with experience, but the recent collective trauma we've all experienced put a kibosh on them recruiting for a while, it seemed, and well, that didn't pick up again because I think I'm now pushing the max age. I wasn't at the time. But I think I mentioned that peace was my goal. Canada was known to be a leader in global peacekeeping. Right, so I applied. Sadly, the lowest mark they let in the previous year was 94, so I didn't get in. I was invited to join, like at tank crew or infantry. He said they needed, right? And that didn't quite. I was so disappointed having missed out on the military college because it would have been nice to get some education as well as the experience, the hands-on, right? The both, academic and hands-on. That's why I went to college. I was able to go to one of our most prestigious colleges, Queens. I was accepted at Queens. Now I'm thinking back. I certainly hope. I did get a bonus in my marks because the high school I went to was much, much harder. And I probably would have got a little bit because I was French immersion as well. Right, I passed the literacy tests in both languages, so yeah, I wonder. But we didn't have such a thing as an affirmative action. In fact, technically, I got kind of a raw deal when it came to applying as a disabled student in college, so I don't think it would have helped with my entrance into Queens. master. There was a list that I could have gone to, but I chose college because it was much more, what do you call it, hands-on. And me not being a good student at all, I thought I would have just flunked right out of university, right? But it seems it's this balance that we need to find between, hands-on and academic, right? This balance, I've endlessly talked about this. But what I was getting at is what jumped out at me. It's even worse on Wikipedia. But what jumped out at me when I went to Britannica, just to look up what NATO stand for, just to make sure I remembered correctly. What leapt off the page is this is Britannica. This isn't this history or just facts. The first two entries were news, current news. I found that weird. Then what I found even weirder is they had Article 5 highlighted, which is about them going to war to protect one of the parties of NATO. And then what leapt off the page for me is they talked about what the articles were about and never once mentioned the word peace. And why that leaps off the page for me is because through this entire Britannica article and the Wikipedia article, they talk about Article 5. But again, I want to talk about Britannica because Wikipedia might change, right? And we all know it might be subject to biases. But Britannica, I thought, was independent. It would be not subject to these biases. So they have the news, and then in the next section talking about what NATO's about, they mention Article 5, which is about going to war. Article 5. But they don't mention the entire articles. They don't link to the entire articles. And as I say in the text of the Britannica paragraph about NATO, they don't mention peace. They mention war and, these member parties. So separately I had to go look, and here's another little surprise for me. The articles weren't available anywhere except from NATO and a couple other weird, obscure, I don't even know if they had the proper articles. But if you think about that, so if it's only available from one site, they could change it on a whim, right? Because it was only available at one reputable site, right? NATO and themselves. But nothing, for the most part, blogs and less than reputable type sites or articles about NATO themselves. Imagine, that's, to me, a little weird. Say if I look up a doctor or a philosopher, or you name it, somebody in a field, if I don't see any bio, that makes me a little bit weird. Like, how do you not have a bio, something? Why isn't there more links than just your own personal? This is what happens. It tends to be their personal foundation or their personal corporation that they're the founder and CEO of, and those are the only links that come up, right? Not even if they are a founder of their own corporation. Why isn't there a reviews and such, right? I mean, you can do this. I looked it up before, the Declaration of Human Rights. At least that you can access. It's very easy to get the entire list. But so here, I can only get the articles of NATO on the website. But at least that is very clear, and that's what I had remembered as well. Besides what NATO stood for, I remembered at least the gist of what the NATO articles. I think there's, 13 articles, plus the preamble, the opener. And so there's some clarification articles in there. I mean, it really is less than 10 articles. And only a couple of them are talking about war. Right? But that's what they quoted on the Britannica side. That's what they're mentioned in news articles and when they're talking about NATO, what NATO's about. But what is glaring is because even Article 5, when it talks about parties, it's clear in the complete articles that parties are NATO members. So we're not talking about a NATO member here, which is even more glaring. So that might be why they're allowing people to think any party in Europe means a party, but it's NATO members when they refer to parties. But most glaring and impossible to ignore about this issue is the preamble opens with their stated goal as being peace at almost all costs. Not mentioned in the Britannica or any of these articles I've read about NATO that are in the current zeitgeist. Like I say, I guess we could say that, right? Because older stuff, we'd have to go to the Wayback Machine, which I don't think is an option. It really is not an option. We can't rely on that for our history and our knowledge. Right? This stuff needs to survive us and a power outage and a data corruption. Right? So, no mention that the preamble, the stated objectives of the articles themselves is about peace at near all cost, right? Their first goal is peace and maintain peace and protect from damage and war. I mean, remember, NATO, this is right after the Second World War, so they didn't want to see Europe destroyed because of war. So their stated objective is not war. It's the opposite of war. It's to prevent war, prevent it, to seek peace. But besides the preamble, and as I said, most articles, and including Britannica, not mentioning peace at all, the first 4 articles, right? So again, they shared the 5th article on this Britannica article, 5th article, but the first 4 all mention peace. So to me, that seems odd. What's changed? Because I haven't been paying attention. Because as I said, be 20 plus years ago, say 25 years ago, completely in the know about this stuff, and NATO was about peace because we were the what would you call that, the what do they call it, the pointy end of the spear. That's what we were, Canada, right? That's where we went if they needed peacekeeping. And so that's what the objective was. It was clear and it was stated. I mean, gosh, it almost became part of the Canadian uniform. The NATO badge, the NATO patch, the NATO and UN, right? United Nations, which by the way is also mentioned in the preamble and in the first articles. First 4 articles, right? The United Nations and peace and preventing harm. But we seem to be in a different world now where when we know that people don't tend to look past the headline, we've become a society that doesn't. Even though we know that they know that we know that we don't read past. Right? I was just reading, oh, geez, I wish I had written that down. Oh, I remember now. So here's the posterity. If you read about Goodhart's law, that's the, when a measure becomes the target, the measure ceases to be a valuable metric, a valuable measure. It's no longer a measure. It doesn't really tell you what you need. And any measure can be twisted. Any statistic can be twisted. But in Goddard's law, it talks about exactly what I'm saying, is we have to realize that everything is gamed. And if you find a metric that is ungamed, something that is free of influence, almost like the wave idea in physics, like the observer quantity. If you observe something, it will either be one way or the other if it's unobserved, right? So you can't know the state of something because as soon as you observe it, it influences its state. So you can't know of its uninfluenced or denatured state without your bias, whatever. You know what I mean? So here we sit, trying to manufacture consent. Bernays' propaganda right before our eyes. It's Nietzsche's herd mentality, the height of apathy when we know they're lying to us. We know not to trust our lying eyes, but we still do. Right? That's the ultimate loss of agency, of free will. That's I guess you could call it the modern danger I think arguably it brings back Marshall McLuhan. They say that he coined this idea of tune in, turn off, and drop out. Don't quote me on what the actual, but this idea of, can the individual interact with society without being denatured or changed? Can society interact with the individuals without being changed? And there's a whole argument here because, what was it? Jung minimized the self, other aspect, and he minimized Buber, and I think there was a big mistake there because I've said this before. If you look at the Bible, and this is the New Testament, which is even more surprising. You look at the Bible; it talks about in Corinthians. I think it's Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 14, chapter. Don't quote me. It's early and other things, but it speaks of ecclesia, right? We translate it as church from the Greek into English, but it really is the community of like-minded people supporting each other. That's Sangha. In Buddhism, I've mentioned that before, it doesn't specifically mean the Buddhist community. It means any community that's working together to stay together. So I argue that's the essential part. It relates to Buddha's warning us that one of the most difficult things is to walk as a partially or even ultimately fully enlightened being and walk amongst the unenlightened, because it challenges your enlightenment at every step of the way. And you know what we are like as a human creature. We tend to be easily put off of our goals. I think about New Year's resolutions in a Western, if I can use that without being too Western-centric, colonial, as it were. Oh no, I guess it wouldn't be, would it? But I just find some of these philosophers warned us about this. And slowly over time, we worked out philology. That was actually in a podcast. We were talking about this idea of the importance of philology was even becoming less important, I guess we could say 100 and plus years ago. So this appreciation for the importance of language, I think we might be able to attribute the reason why Bertrand Russell did that one book or seminar, I can't remember, about language, the important language and representation of language. Right, language is an object. There's the idea of an object, right, and there's the object. So this idea of what language is about, what it denotes, and I think I mentioned this before, there's an error in there. There's a misunderstanding that there is a much richer mythology and myth illusion in the Sino-Japanese characters than they even realized. But the idea is, like the other night, we were chatting and I mentioned being saddled. Somebody was being saddled with something. And the wife chuckled and said, "That's weird, you know, how stuff comes up." And I just explained to her it's all language is representative of an object. But in this case, the word saddled represents a saddle being put on a horse, right? So it's not just an object, but it's a concept. But then what we've done here culturally is we've attached a deeper meaning. So when I say saddled, I do mean the idea of a saddle being placed on a horse, but it's the idea of a burden being placed on you that you must carry, right? Your lodestone, your burden to carry, right? It is funny how this shapes, but I wonder if there's an avenue for us to look at what happens when we try to artificially control that, right? If we try to, like 1984, this idea of changing the language purposely. Is it possible? Is it problematic? What would be the problems? I mean, arguably, I think it's impossible. I think there's a million examples of what ends up happening. It tends to evolve and shape itself into something different. I mean, almost like the brain, right? You take away an area's use, it'll take over for another use, and I think vice versa. I've mentioned this before. I think if you have some damage in a certain area of the brain that is essential, I think there's the extra space. Maybe that's what that extra quote unquote useless space up there might be for if we need to take over. Right, I mentioned before. I wonder if when I took that softball to the head as a kid, I wonder if it did cause some issues, but because my language center, the area where language, and it does a whole bunch of jazz, because it took over, I wonder if it's possible that that's what was responsible for causing me to be extremely verbal, in spite of every metric stated that I should have been very nonverbal. All right, but yeah, that's what I was mentioning. I've said this before. This idea, language is tied to the culture. The culture, right, shapes the language. Language is essentially the embodiment of a culture, right? Language shapes consciousness. Consciousness is ourselves, right? You can't have I and the other without the culture, the society. You can't have interactions of two very interior beings without language. So arguably this is a big deal. If we begin to denature our language, if we begin to be afraid to speak about certain things, I mean, even if we begin to be afraid to speak certain words because they could be misconstrued, we've seen that with, yeah. But what's worse than being afraid is the malevolence of maybe purposefully misleading, right? Because that might be happening up here in Canada. It looks like maybe our our PM may have lied by using language, right? Stating that, kind of like the joke I made about, I don't know if I made it the other day, the joke about I did not have relations with that. I mean, he might have been speaking about something specific, like our PM did recently. He said he wasn't briefed on ministers getting paid.